All right, we're going to look at some key concepts here as we begin. Okay, we're going to look at history, we're going to look at theology and philosophy, and that's really what this course is. It's the history of Christian, going to the theology, thought, which is philosophy. All right, so let's take a look at each of these concepts. Again, you've heard of these, but let's take a look actually and unpack what this is. Let's begin with what is history. All right, as we begin here, what are some ways that we understand the past? If you have me for um, the freshman history course, World History 1, that's where we begin. How do we understand the past? And in most of my history classes, I kind of come back to this because this is important. Um, how do we understand the past? Well, there are various ways. There's oral history. Think about my grandfather. I used to love talking to him about his early life. He grew up in the Depression, and all the stuff that went around with that. He had a kind of a somewhat tragic but interesting childhood, and that is one way I learned about the past. I learned about that era from him, from the people who actually lived there. So that's oral history. Then we have archaeology, right? Those are archaeology is defined as or archaeological artifacts are defined as the remains, human remains, that are available to us for study. Basically, these are things that we usually find in the ground, but not necessarily. It can be things like architecture and things like that as well. But these are physical remains left by people, and we can learn a lot from that. The main way that we really study history, though, is through historical documents. All right, so we can uncover a whole city by archaeological methods, but it's the writing itself, it's the historical documents in whatever form that may be, that's going to really fill in the information there. We don't know anything about this city that we just uncovered. Well, wait a minute. Here's a library with a bunch of scrolls. It tells us names. It tells us their own history, their own things about their own culture, their own literature, maybe. And so we understand a lot of things through historical documents. Okay. In this class, you're going to be interacting a lot with those historical documents. You're going to be looking at stuff from the early church, from the Middle Ages, from the Reformation, from more modern times as well. And so you'll be examining those yourself. Sometimes we come across things in history that are hard to explain, hard to understand. We don't have all the answers. That's what history is. Um, it's not necessarily what actually happened. Now, stay with me here. Um, there is objective truth in the past, things that actually happened. This is what happened. Historians, though, don't have a television that they watch and say, okay, well, I'm watching this happen. Okay, and then I can just write it down like that. No, we have to use those sources that I mentioned to kind of reconstruct it. And that's what history is. Sometimes history is really bad. There are people that approach it with bias. And when that happens, yeah, your narrative, your historical narrative is going to be distorted a bit. A lot of times what happens is historians say, okay, based on the evidence that we have right now, here's what we think happened. Here's what we think happened in this period, or here's why we think this person did that. There might be 100 years that go by after someone writes about that, and then all of a sudden there's new documents, there's new archaeological evidence, there's new, whatever that comes in here and informs historians better. And now all of a sudden they're saying, you know what, our historical narrative doesn't seem to fit the evidence anymore. So what do? We don't just ignore the evidence. We have to change the historical narrative. Okay. One of the things that helps historians is what's called models. Models are just things that help us understand something better, right? Um, and you're familiar with models. I'm not talking about clothing models, although maybe there's some similarities there too. But you're familiar with models, perhaps. You ever seen like one of those scaled down models of a building? Here's, architects do that, right? They're trying to sell this design to someone. There's one of these in my church. There's a section of our church that has basically under glass, there's a model of what our church was supposed to look like, all right, before it was actually built. and it's really cool to look at. My kids love going by there and seeing it. Models in history sometimes can be physical models like that. A lot of times, though, they're just ways of thinking about things. I took a Greek history class one time in grad school, and the one of the two competing models that people were, I mean, really getting worked up about. I was really too apathetic about the subject matter to to go either way on this that dogmatically. But it was over the term city-state. In Greek, that's the polis. That just means basically a self-governing city. It's basically its own little nation right there, or own little kingdom. And in Greek history, there are basically two main models that historians use to understand exactly what is a city-state, how did it function, and there are two competing views. So there are some historians that say, I'm in this camp, other ones say I'm in this camp, all right? And perhaps, over the next couple of decades, maybe more information comes from maybe new manuscripts that we find or new archaeological evidence that we find. And maybe one of those camps would say, you know what, this evidence seems to fit ours better, so that helps us. And maybe the other camp says, you know what, you're right. You do seem to be correct in the way that you're thinking about that. Models in history are important. And like I said, sometimes they are physical models, and sometimes they are, I guess, more nebulous than that, just ways of thinking through things. Here's an example. Here's an example of a physical model of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Has the different passageways, the different chambers. And it's just a way for us to understand, okay, this is what it looks like. And then people kind of piece together, okay, this is probably what this was for. This is probably what this was for. Some other examples. There's evolutionary model of world religions. One of the, I guess, probably the first class I ever taught was a world religions course. And in it, you do have to deal a little bit with this particular model. And it's the idea, a lot of people have this idea, is that that religion has just evolved over time, okay? By that I mean we started off worshiping all these different gods. Eventually we said, you know what, yeah, maybe there's a lot of gods, but we're just going to focus on one. And then we got to monotheism, where it said, you know what, there aren't any other gods, there's just this one. And then some contemporary scholars would say, you know what, we've even evolved further, where now a lot of people are saying there is no God. And that's an evolutionary model of trying to understand religion. I don't agree with that model, but that is one way that people try to understand the spread of religion. Another example, lost cause narrative of the U.S. Civil War. I did some editing, content editing, I guess this last summer for Ed Stetzer, who's writing a chapter in a book on that deals a little bit with this. The lost cause narrative of Civil War is viewing, especially the Southern Confederacy, as being a lost cause. And so you start seeing this pop up in the decades following the Civil War. It's the idea that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was, people fighting for Southern rights and Southern honor. And it's basically a changing of the historical documents, or I guess a negating of the historical documents in favor of a more romanticized look at the Civil War. Again, I wouldn't be one to follow that particular narrative, but that is a very popular one that's still out there. And again, that's just a way, it's a model that some folks use to understand the Civil War. Again, these models can be right, they can be wrong, and hopefully the people that hold to these different models will be able to change their models as new evidence comes forward. All right, let's take a look at the use of sources in history. Primary sources and secondary sources. If you've had English Comp 2, hopefully you're familiar with both of these. Primary sources are what derives from the actual thing being studied. So if we're studying John Calvin, for example, you could have something like his main theological work, Institutes of the Christian Religion. That would be a primary source. That was something written by John Calvin. You could also have something like the church that he used to preach in. That would technically be a primary source. It'd be an archaeological source, but that would work as well. From the primary sources, that's how we create our historical narratives, okay? And the historical narratives that are put together are going to be your secondary sources. Secondary sources are things like biographies, textbooks, things like that that are put together by scholars saying, okay, we've looked over the primary sources. Here's our interpretation of what happened. Some of those people do a great job of that. Some folks don't, and that's just how it goes. And it's our job as readers to be able to critically approach those and say, you know what, I agree with 80% of what you're saying here. This seems to be wrong, or you said this, but that seems to go against these primary sources here that say this and this and this. And so secondary sources are deriving from the primary sources, and they are hopefully interpreting those correctly. All right, let's move on to theology. What is theology? Well, it's the study of God, but it is actually more than that. I mean, theology proper is technically the study of God the Father, but this is the general term theology that deals with our dogmatic beliefs in not only God but Scripture and everything that surrounds that. Okay. Here's some approaches to theology. You'll need to know these. And there are different ways to slice this up. There is systematic theology. That's usually how we teach, obviously, our systematic theology courses here, but Bible doctrine is also taught in a systematic approach. That's where you say, you know what, this week we're studying God the Father. Next week we're studying Christology, which is God the Son. A couple of weeks from now we'll be studying soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. And it's when you get into those, it's topical, really. Okay, here's all that we know about salvation based on stuff from different parts of Scripture, and by looking at all of this, here's our conclusions that we can make. Biblical theology is the next approach to theology. That's where you say, we're going to study theology, and we're going to do it from the text itself. Now, obviously, systematic theology uses the biblical text, but this is going to be, I'm reading Romans 3 right now, okay? And instead of saying, what is everything, what does it say about sin in this chapter? What does it say about salvation in this chapter? I'm going to actually be saying, what does it say in this chapter in general? And it may say some things about salvation. It may say some things about sin. It may say some stuff about Christ. Whatever is in that chapter or that section of text, I'm going to be pulling out. So it's not so much topical as it's textual, okay? So biblical theologians are going to be concerned with immediate context. Okay, here's a passage here. Let's look at the immediate context and understand what it's saying. They're going to be concerned with genre. So we're reading this part of Revelation. This is apocalyptic literature. What is this referring to? This genre of literature is usually using various allegories. Okay, so what does that mean for this particular passage? That's biblical theology. Pastoral theology is going to be the practical, and sometimes it's called practical theology, but it's the practical application of theology. So, for example, at the end of grad school, I had an elective left. They said you can take literally anything you want. I looked at the options. It's like, you know what? I've been doing a lot of kind of heady academic stuff. I actually want to do a pastoral theology course. So I took pastoral theology. I actually really enjoyed it. And it teaches you all kinds of stuff. It's obviously geared towards those doing ministry. So they teach you things like, okay, how do you baptize somebody? And we have a pastoral theology course, and usually about once a year there's a point where those folks go through basically practicing baptizing each other, obviously outside the water, because that's important. It's important to know how to do that. In my pastoral theology course that I took, we had to write a church constitution. We had to do a doctrinal statement. We had to do these things that would have a practical application. Historical theology, that's where we're going to be spending a lot of our time. This is understanding theology in the midst of a historical narrative. So we're not going to be going doctrine by doctrine through things. We're going to be going chronologically through things. So obviously we begin with Greek thought, but then when we get to the early church, we'll start looking at some of the theology that was being thrown around there for good and bad, and we'll kind of trace that. We'll come back to Greek thought where we're talking about Augustine and Aquinas and some of these other folks. Um, Historical theology is, for me, very interesting because you can trace the bits of thought, the bits of theology that pop up here and there, maybe in the early church, maybe in the Middle Ages, and then in the Enlightenment period, in the 20th century, you'll see the stuff pop up again. And some people act like, oh no, what are we going to do with this issue? We've never seen anything like this before. Well, yeah, we have. It was 500 years ago here, or it was 1,000 years ago in this situation, and here's what this guy said about it. And so historical theology, even though it deals mostly with the past, there's a lot of things, or actually a whole lot of things, that was dealt with in the past theologically that is very applicable to today. Our church, evangelical church in general today, has historical amnesia. I grew up in a church that I'm pretty sure thought that the church started in 1940, and there wasn't anything before that. And so when we approach Christianity like that, we miss out on a rich history, yes, but we also miss out on ways of thinking through the Bible, ways of thinking through theology that are maybe a little bit different than what we're used to, but it's it's folks in the past that were trying to be faithful to Scripture, faithful to Orthodox theology, and they came up with some really brilliant things. There's a lot in my own theology there. I'm like, I'm really struggling understanding this, and then I'll pull out someone like Anselm, and who's in the Middle Ages, and you know what? He was a lot smarter than me, and he dealt with some of those same things that maybe I was struggling with or trying to figure out. And that's very true for a lot of doctrines, a lot of things in Scripture. All right, we talked about models in history. It's probably, especially if you've had biblical interpretation and Bible doctrine, it's probably a little easier for you to conceive of models in theology. Some examples of models in theology would be things like dispensationalism, covenant theology. These are ways that theologians have put together to say, based on what we've read from Scripture, here's the best way to interpret Scripture. Dispensationalists would say the best way to interpret Scripture is to say Israel and the church are separate, and here's why we believe that. And obviously, because we're taking that route, here's some interpretations that we're going to come out of that with. Same thing with covenant theology or other different models. I think of it a lot of times as scaffolding, right? We have our theology that hopefully is based on Scripture, and we have this scaffolding around it that kind of holds it together. The idea being that here's how we're putting these bits of things that we're getting from Scripture, this different theology together, and hopefully we are constructing something that is biblical. And hopefully we are humble enough. This is where theological humility comes into play. But hopefully we're also humble enough that when our structure, our scaffolding, doesn't fit what Scripture is saying, hopefully we're honest enough and humble enough to say, you know what, we need to change our structure instead of just ignoring bits of Scripture. All right, the next one, philosophy. So we've done history, theology, now we're on philosophy. What is philosophy? I'm going to explain it to you through these 3 points, truth, philosophy, and cognition, really quick, just so you understand the differences here. You'll need to know these for the exam. Truth is what something actually is. Philosophy, then, is how we conceptualize knowledge, truth, ethics. Okay, it's basically, think of it like the filter that truth is coming through, okay? And then we arrive at what we believe about something. That's called cognition. So truth is what something actually is. Philosophy is basically how we conceptualize, the study of how we conceptualize knowledge, truth, ethics, things like that. Like I said, a lot of times our philosophy is the filter in which truth comes through. and then we arrive at our cognition, what we actually believe about something. Okay. Ideally, our cognition is going to be very close to the truth. What we believe about something, hopefully, is very close to what something actually is. Obviously, that's not always the case, but that is ideally what should happen. Okay, in conclusion, I want you to review the syllabus. I want you to ask me questions as necessary. How do you do that? Just send me an email. I'm usually very, very quick to respond. So take a look at the syllabus, read over everything. It is totally it's totally on you, basically, to follow that course schedule. I send out announcements every week, but more than that, like due dates, things like that is on you. Late stuff is generally not accepted. If there's some type of real emergency, some type of documented emergency that comes up, that's a different story. Contact me and we can talk about it. But generally speaking, late work is not accepted, so make sure you're on top of that stuff. Next, plan out your coursework, not just for this class, but all your classes. I'm going to tell you up front that you're going to be spending a lot of time in this class listening to lectures. We're going to have multiple lectures each week. And they are usually full-size lectures. These aren't like 10-minute bits. And we are also going to be doing a lot of reading. And so that on top of research and stuff like that, you need to plan that out. Otherwise, it's going to just be a train wreck. And so especially if you're doing multiple classes, and most of you are, just make sure you plan it out, okay? Next, begin thinking about your research paper for a class. This is a significant part of your final grade. It's also a significant project. If you don't know what you want to do, think about, is there an area of theology that interests you in particular? So maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Maybe you want to talk about, I don't know, infant baptism or something like that versus believers' baptism. That would be something that you could do. Is there a time period that interests you in particular? I'll be honest with you, there are some areas of history I just don't have any interest in. That's the great thing about history, is that you can get off the history train at any stop you want. You can get off and talk about art or theology or music or literature. All that stuff's connected to history, right? So there's a lot in there. There is a lot of leeway in this particular course, more so than even a lot of the other history courses I do, in terms of the time period that you can choose from. You can choose something fairly contemporary, but most of you will choose something, maybe from the Reformation or maybe even before that. It's pretty open-ended. As long as it connects some way as long as it connects some way to church history, historical theology, philosophy, any of that would work. I want you to read specifically, though, about the instructions for the research paper. This is not just a general research paper. There are specific things you need to do for this paper, and I've kind of outlined it for you in our syllabus. Make sure that what you are doing is not some type of biography paper. That's not what this is. In this research paper, you're going to be interacting with the primary sources, and you're going to be graded on that. And then you're going to be graded also on your interaction with the secondary sources. So a lot of times what that will look like is, in your research paper, you will say, here's what this source says, here's what I'm thinking that this source means to back up my conclusion. Here's some secondary sources, some scholars that would agree with me. Or sometimes, here's a scholar that doesn't agree with me, but here's here's how I would counter that argument. And so that's fine to do too. Lastly, ask questions. I mentioned this several times during this lecture. Ask questions as they come up. Sometimes that's questions about your assignments. Ask those. Sometimes that's questions about the course content. You didn't understand something. That's very common for this class. Just because of some of the heavy stuff we'll be doing, that's going to be very true as we go into Greek thought. There's a lot of stuff here that you probably haven't heard of before, or maybe I'm approaching it from a different perspective than you're familiar with. And so it's very common in a main campus class to have to explain this 2 or 3 different times, maybe from different ways. So if I explain it, and then maybe explain it again in the lecture, but you still don't quite get it, then we can email back and forth, or maybe we can set up a time to talk by phone. That's fine too. All right, I'm really looking forward to having you in this class this semester. I think you'll enjoy it. There is a lot of variety in how we approach things, and we're going to be covering a lot of things that you probably haven't had in other classes before. Um, and hopefully, your research paper also allows you to really delve in depth into a subject that you want to. All right, again, ask questions, and I look forward to interacting with you on the discussion board this week. Our next lecture will be on pre Socratic philosophy and the philosophy of Plato.